Welcome back to day 3 of the Lotte Sew Along. Yesterday we completed our pocket panel with our sides, so you will need that. You will need your sleeves, your front top panel, as well as your back. In the instructions, it does have a little blurb about optionally putting some wash away stabilizer or a piece of knit interfacing just to help prevent your seam from waving. So I went ahead and did that. It is optional. So decide if you want to add that or not. We're now going to place our top panel right sides together with our pocket panel, aligning our crossbody seam, and we're going to clip that in place without stretching. Now, when you get to the middle piece where our pocket is, make sure you're clipping all 3 of the pocket layers with your top layer and that nothing has curled in and everything is nice and flat. We now need to sew this together, and I will be using my serger. You can use a stretch stitch of your choice. We will be sewing this together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we're going to be stitching down the entire crossbody seam of this panel. Now, because I'll be using a serger, my edges will already be finished. If you're using a stretch stitch, you can go ahead and once you finish that seam, go back down the edge and zigzag over the edge to finish that off like we did on our side panels. We're now going to iron our seam up towards our top. Top stitching down our front panel is optional. I'm going to go ahead and do it. If you are as well, your seam should be pointed up towards your top panel, and we're going to stitch down on that top panel with about 1/6 to 1/4 of an inch away from your bottom pocket panel. Just making sure that you are keeping a consistent stitch down the entire length of your front panel. I finished top stitching my front panel, and I like to give it a good press on both the front side and the back side, right down that top stitching and that seam. It is suggested in section 8 to stabilize your shoulder seams. So I used a small strip of knit interfacing on the wrong side of the left and right shoulder. We now need to grab our back panel, and we are going to place our back panel right sides together with our front panel, and we're going to match up our shoulder seams and pin those in place. They should line right up. You should not have to stretch anything. And pin down the shoulder seam on both the left and the right side. I'm back over at my serger with my reinforced and pinned shoulder seams. And again, you can use your stretch stitch if you want. And we are going to stitch the shoulder seams together with a 1/4 of an inch. And if you are using a stretch stitch, remember to go back in after you do your seam and finish off your edges with a zigzag stitch on both the left and the right side. We're going to iron our seam towards the back panel, and then it is optional to go back in and do a top stitch on that shoulder seam. I did opt not to do the top stitching on the shoulder seam. You can if you want. You'll do it on that back panel, right, 1/6 to 1/4 of an inch away from the seam. I do have my seam ironed towards the back, and we're now going to add our sleeve. Your sleeve is going to have 2 notches, a center notch and a notch that needs to be positioned to the front of the hoodie. Remember, you should have cut your sleeves mirrored, so when you're looking at your sleeves right side up, the notches will be on different sides. So I have my body facing right side up, and I have grabbed the appropriate sleeve, and I am placing my sleeve with the center notch right sides together with the center of the shoulder. Pin that in place, and I am making sure that my shoulder seam is pointed towards the back. And now we're going to line up our front armhole and get that clipped in place, matching up your front notches. And then you're going to go ahead and ease the rest of your front armhole in place. You should not have to stretch anything. Once you have the front of your armhole pinned in place, we're going to move to the back of the armhole and get that pinned. And I like to get the corner pinned, and then I'll move back up to that center and start easing down the back of the armhole and get that all pinned in place. Again, nothing should have to be stretched to fit. We're going to do this to both the left sleeve and the right sleeve. Now, remember, your sleeves are mirrored, so make sure you're attaching them to the correct side. Once you have your sleeves pinned to your armhole, this is what it should look like. We are now going to sew our sleeves onto our body, and we're going to do this with 1/4 inch, either with your serger or a stretch stitch, and making sure that nothing else gets caught, and your shoulder seam, if you did not top stitch that, is pointed towards the back of your body. Do this to both the left and the right sleeve. If you are using a stretch stitch, remember to go back in and zigzag down the edge to finish off your seam. Now that you have your sleeve sewn on, you'll go ahead and give that a good ironing the seam towards the sleeves on both sides. We now need to pin the sides. I like to clip it in 4 spots, starting at the hem, moving up to the notches and matching the notches on the front panel and the back, moving up to the armpit and matching that seam. Now I like to offset my seam so it's not bulky. I'll have one seam pointed down and the other seam pointed up, and then I will butt the right sides of that seam together, and that matches the seam up. You can have the seam going in one direction, the same direction. I just find that it's a little bit more bulky and the seam does tend to shift when you sew it. And then I will move down to the cuff and match that up and pin that in place. And then you can go back in and clip between your points. Do this to both the left side and the right side. Both your sides are pinned now, so we are going to head over to the machine and stitch this together. We are back over at our sewing machine, and you're either going to be using a serger or a stretch stitch of your choice. We will be sewing the side seams together with 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure that our raw edges are aligned, nothing shifts on us. Now, when you do get down to the armpit seam, because it is bulkier, it does tend to want to shift on you. So just be cautious of that, making sure that you're holding that in place while you're sewing over it. You're going to do this to both the left side seam and the right side seam. And if you are using a stretch stitch, you're going to want to go back in and zigzag over the edges of those seams to finish those off. And our bodice is complete. So we added our back, we added our sleeves, and we sewed our side seams together. Now tomorrow is a catch-up day, so we'll be back on day 5 and we will construct the hood. So go ahead and take a picture of today's task and post that in day 3 of the Fandea fabric sew along. Thanks everyone.